This podcast is on design, sampling, and ethical considerations in survey research. We've been focusing on writing survey questions. We've been focusing on issues regarding error in survey question responses, such as validity, reliability, and measurement error. Now we're going to move on to sampling consideration. How do we find a sample that will work for us? In other words, we want our sample to be able to speak to a wider population. So we have to define our population first, thus the entire population that we are analyzing. And then from that population, we can find a sampling frame, or a list of people who could be surveyed. We often have to seek approval to get this type of information. So for instance, if we wanted to ask undergraduate students at a specific university, that would be our target population, then the sampling frame would be a list of all the students' email addresses. Now, we can't just use this without the permission of the appropriate authorities. So we have to get that permission first before we can engage in this survey. Assuming we get this permission, then we can choose the sample. Random selection is the best practice in order for our sample to speak to a population. What we mean by random sampling is that each person within the population has an equal chance of participating in the survey, or has an equal opportunity to get into the sample. If that's the case, then we can speak to a broader population on the basis of a smaller, randomly selected sample. There are different types of sampling within this notion of random sampling. We can first of all call our technique simple random sampling if we just simply have every unit on the list having the same probability of being selected as a survey respondent. So that's called simple random sampling. That's the gold standard. We can start to get this random sample by using what's called systematic sampling. We start at a random number on the list, and then every X person after that gets selected. In other words, if we randomly decide to start with person number 12, and then we choose as our X10, then the 12th person, the 22nd person, the 32nd person, the 42nd person, the 52nd person, and so on and so forth are being selected to participate in the survey as part of the randomly selected sample. So if we have a random number that we start with, then we can ensure that we will get a random selection. Other types of sampling include what are called stratified samples. Thus, we divide the sampling frame into strata, or groups with specific characteristics, such as which U.S. states people live in, and then sample from each strata. Now, this is to ensure that the sample has the same proportion of individuals from each strata as the population does. So we need to make sure that that happens. So for instance, we don't oversample on Idahoans, for instance, if we wish to have a sample that represents the U.S. public. We don't undersample large states like California or Florida or Texas. So we have to divide the sampling frame into appropriate strata. There's what's called cluster sampling as well, where we divide the sampling frame into clusters, and then we randomly select different clusters and survey all people within the randomly selected clusters. So if we divided the state of Idaho into districts of some sort, then we can randomly select those districts and then survey people within those randomly selected districts and create a cluster random sample. Remember, it goes from population to sampling frame to sample. That's the process in order to find the right sample for us to use to generalize about the larger population. That's what's key here. Our sample should allow us to make generalizations about the larger population. Sometimes it's not possible to have truly random samples. Thus, we have techniques that are called non-probability sampling. Sometimes it's hard to find the type of respondents we are interested in. So we engage in what's called snowball sampling and volunteer sampling. A snowball sample involves where I asked you, for instance, to participate in the survey, and then I ask you to think of 5 or 10 other people who might be interested in taking the survey. They could be 5 or 10 of your friends, business associates, school colleagues. But that's the way that I would build up my sample, is to find people in snowballing effect who will take the survey. That's definitely not random selection, probability sampling in that sense. It's called non-probability sampling for a reason. But it is a way for me to get enough of a sample to at least make some inferences about a larger population. A similar technique is volunteer sampling. I just seek volunteers to take the sample, or to take the questions in the survey and be part of the sample. So the volunteers thus make up the sample, and they may be biased in a certain way. Maybe it's all of a particular class in the undergraduate population, could be people within a certain neighborhood and not representing other neighborhoods within the city. But at least, again, I would get a large enough sample where I could say something about the overall population. So sampling error occurs when the sample is not representative of the population, which is more likely in these non-probability samples than in the probability sampling that we described earlier. So we could overrepresent majority groups, underrepresent minority groups, and there are specific types of people who might refuse to take the survey. And if that's the case, all of that throws error into our responses. If specific types of people are not represented, then the results will not represent the population. The results will only be representative of the types of people who are in the survey. So if an election poll and I fail to survey enough African Americans about their intended vote choice, and African Americans turn out to vote, then my survey is going to be way off in terms of being able to make any assessment about how the overall population is going to vote. If we don't survey enough African Americans, we know that African Americans tend to vote for Democrats, then the intended votes for Democrats in my survey will be underrepresented. And it will seem more likely that the Republicans are going to win, but that is an artificial impact of my poor sampling frame. My sample error will thus lead to misleading conclusions. Okay, so after we do the sample, get that correct, and write our questions correctly, then we need to choose our mode of doing a survey. Different types of survey modes include over the phone, in person, online, by mail. So there are issues with all of these. Well, if we think about phones, we used to use landline phones. This current generation, a very small percentage of us have landlines. If we only focus on landlines, we're going to miss a certain segment of the population that only has mobile phones. As well, people often screen their calls prior to just answering them cold, so they might just simply refuse to answer the phone. People who do answer the phone often have more free time on their hands, which could be due to not working, which would lead to an overrepresentation of non-workers in the sample. So these are all potential issues if we just simply rely on phone respondents for our sampling frame in our survey. It used to be that surveys were only conducted in person. There's a famous survey called the National Election Study, which is one that's used a lot in political science, and it was given person to person for an hour. Imagine answering questions for an hour. These are back in the 50s and 60s and 70s when the in-person format was used the most. But in-person has some disadvantages too. Surveyor characteristics could influence the answers. If the surveyor is not well trained, then the responses may not be valid. They may be recorded incorrectly. People may be more likely to give misleading answers to a particular surveyor. So it's better for respondents to fill out the survey on their own. We could try online sampling, and many survey research firms do that. It's fairly hard to find a random sample online. Those who complete online surveys often don't have to work during the day or work particular types of jobs that are clerical in nature, perhaps. So the sample may not be representative of the population because it may not take into account those who just can't afford to spend time answering a survey online. Another type of way to give a survey is by mail. I've done those in the past. I've surveyed Idaho County elected officials by mail. But people tend to not really use paper mail much anymore. They might think it's junk mail. They throw it away, more likely to throw it away, in fact. So that mode also has some challenges. Other considerations in designing a survey. So this is the ethical side of things. If we're conducting a survey as part of our studies at Boise State University, we have to make sure, first of all, you speak to your instructor, and then you also have to follow all different kinds of protocols. For instance, you have to get approval for your survey, if you're doing a survey, through something called the Institutional Review Board. The Institutional Review Board makes sure that human subjects are protected, that they are not done any harm by one's survey. So they look very closely at your survey instrument on whether or not you can guarantee anonymity, which you really need to do in order to protect human subjects. And if those things are in line, then the Institutional Review Board will give approval for your survey. But if not, they'll ask you to revise and come up with a better procedure. Informed consent. Right? So respondents need to read and sign an informed consent form which says, I understand that I'm going to be participating in the survey. The surveyor will do my best to make sure that my responses are in complete confidence. And that informed consent needs to be kept on file if you're doing this type of survey. Informed consent involves what the survey is about, who is conducting the survey, and what the purpose of the survey is. Respondents should be told that you do not have to answer any questions that make you feel uncomfortable and that you can exit the survey at any time. Respondents should be told that the answers they provide will be in the strictest confidence and all the results will be anonymous. In other words, if we write a report of some sort, we're not going to identify any individual survey respondent. When you think about funding, right, you need, if you want to do a professional study, you'll need some resources for the project. You'll need a survey research firm that has specialized expertise in asking survey questions, finding an appropriate sample. So you'll need to work with your organization to identify funds in order to conduct a survey. And in order to find those funds, you'll often have to try to convince people to give you funds. So you need to have a solid understanding of how your survey will help you reach your research goals. You need to make a good presentation, in other words, a compelling one that would tell your organization that you should have your survey funded. And then prior to giving a survey, you want to pre-test the questions. You want to make sure, just using a small group of people, you want to make sure that your questions are good ones. One thing you want to do is you want to have the respondents paraphrase what they think the questions are asking. If that paraphrase matches with the concepts that you are asking, then that's a very good fit. You want to make sure that the small group understands the question and understands the potential answers. You might also find that the respondents in this pretest will want to give a different response than the one that's given. If you don't pretest your questions, then the chances that you're asking a poor question increase because you don't really know if your questions are very good. So pretesting is also very useful. And that is the end of this particular podcast.